Putin, from everything I see, has no respect for this person.
Well, that's because he'd rather have a puppet as president of the United States.
No puppet.
And it's pretty clear.
You're the puppet.
It's pretty clear you won't admit that the Russians.
Good morning and welcome to AM Joy. Well, there's probably nothing more triggering for Trump's base than the suggestion that Hillary Clinton is right about something. But her prognosis back in 2016 that Trump was a puppet for Putin sure looks a lot more plausible after two jaw-dropping reports from this weekend alone. The first from the New York Times, reporting that the FBI opened a counterintelligence inquiry into whether Trump was secretly working for Russia. And now the second bombshell, this time from the Washington Post, reporting that Trump, quote, has gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal details of his conversations with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And that on at least one occasion, Trump took possession of the notes of his own interpreter and instructed the linguist not to discuss what had transpired during his chat with Putin with other administration officials. The White House has now had 38 hours to respond to the New York Times story. And even if the initial shock made it, hard for them to figure out what to say, how to explain that 38 hours later, no one in the administration, including Trump himself, has been able to utter the simple phrase, of course the president isn't working for the Kremlin. Instead, what we've seen are these weird umbrage-filled non-denials. Por ejemplo, here is Trump's lengthy non-denial response to his pal Jeanine Pirro on Fox News last night.
Are you now, or have you ever worked for Russia, Mr. President?
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written. But you look at what's going on. I fired James Comey. I call him Lion James Comey because he was a terrible liar, and he did a terrible job as the FBI director. Look at what happened with Hillary Clinton. The folks in Russia. I've been tougher on Russia than anybody else, probably any other president, period, including the fact that we're doing oil like we've never done it. We're setting records in our country with oil and exporting oil and many other things. I think it was a great insult, and the New York Times is a disaster as a paper. It's a very horrible thing they said.
Okay, just a TV note. Our producers cut that down from a 2-minute answer. Okay, 2-minute answer by Donald Trump. And in case you're counting, it was 349 words that Trump spoke. 349 words, none of which were the word no. Let's bring in our mega panel to break this all down. Joining me now, Frank Figliuzzi, MSNBC national security analyst and former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI. Jill Wine-Banks, former assistant Watergate special prosecutor. Natasha Bertrand of The Atlantic. Maya Wiley, senior vice president for social justice at the New School. And Evelyn Farkas, MSNBC national security analyst. Frank, I'm coming to you first. Thank you for being here in person. We now have you in person. Yesterday we had you call in because we just wanted to talk to you about this. What do you make of the fact that in 38 hours since this story broke, since I spoke with you about it on the Rachel Maddow show, the White House, his lawyers, and Donald Trump himself have yet to utter the phrase, of course the president is not working for Russia?
Joy, I'm thinking you might have a future in FBI interrogation techniques and psycholinguistics, because you're right. If you study the responses, if you study the White House reaction and you study the clips that you just played, you don't have an all-out denial. And it really raises eyebrows if you're someone who's in the interview and human observation business. Something's troubling about that. And let's remember that as we continue to move forward, the FBI opened this case a long time ago with suspicions, but let's look at what's happened since then. As recently as the last 2 weeks, I still see the president sending signals that he's still joined at the hip with Russians. For example, the statement that Russia was right, quote unquote, to go into Afghanistan. For example, the briefing last week by Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin that Nancy Pelosi described as perhaps the worst briefing she's ever received, where he talked about softening sanctions on Russians. we're still seeing that kind of bizarre, unexplainable cozying up and covering for Russia.
It is bizarre, and Jill, let me go to Maya Wiley first. I want to go to a lawyer first. If this was a legal case and you had a defendant who, when asked a very simple question, did what you just heard Frank Pugliese talked about, said everything else. Donald Trump went into every area you could think of, every person he's ever disliked, but he never said he didn't actually do it. If this was a client or a defendant, what would you make of the fact that he simply didn't deny it? And let me just give you what the White House, just for a little background for folks who haven't been paying attention to it as closely. This was how the White House originally responded to the story. The Washington Post story is so outrageously inaccurate it doesn't even warrant a response. The liberal media has wasted 2 years trying to manufacture fake collusion scandal instead of reporting the fact that, unlike President Obama, they hit President Obama, who let Russia and other foreign adversaries push America around. President Trump has actually been tough on Russia. That was something Trump said too, just, I'm tough on Russia, I'm tough on Russia, I'm tough on Russia. And now, here is the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, on Face the Nation.
The notion that President Trump is a threat to American national security is absolutely ludicrous. The idea that's contained in the New York Times story that President Trump was a threat to American national security is silly on its face and not worthy of a response.
And I'm sorry, he's former CIA director and current Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. What would you make of it if a client or a defendant, Maya Wiley, was doing, or their representatives were doing these things rather than just saying, I didn't do it?
If it's my client, I think I have the world's worst witness, that I don't ever want to be on a witness stand, certainly not in front of a jury, let alone a judge. I also, if I'm on the other side, I think this is the worst attempt I have ever seen to distract me from probably one of the most serious allegations that could possibly be made. If you are the commander-in-chief and not the traitor-in-chief, the first and foremost thing you would do, particularly knowing you're staring down the barrel of a prosecutor's gun, is you say no. It is the only thing that comes to your mind. But in this case, what Donald Trump does is what he usually does, and he dissembles into distraction rather than facts. And he absolutely, as a sitting president, if he's going to be responsible, looks dead in the eye of the American people and says, I absolutely am going to respond to this because it's ludicrous. He hasn't done that. Moreover, he can't, given the facts of this case. Remember, just to piggyback on something that Frank said, the FBI briefed Donald Trump about the possibility of Russians trying to infiltrate the campaign when he was nominated and became the Republican nominee. His campaign had already had 7 contacts with Russians at that point, and they never, despite the fact that the FBI asked them to, never then continued to report contact with Russians.
It is bizarre. Evelyn Farkas, I'm going to come to you on this because, to just build on what we've just heard from Frank and Maya, the FBI was alerted to Donald Trump's weird behavior even during the campaign. One piece of the New York Times story. Investigators had watched with alarm as the Republican Party softened its convention platform on the Ukraine crisis in a way that seemed to benefit Russia. It was the only change made to the RNC platform. There were no other changes requested by the Trump campaign. Only this, and it was the change to the Ukraine plank, which had been strong on the idea that Russia should not have taken Crimea. This softened it. It was the only change they made. Item. This was what alarmed them. So, right, the Republican platform does not call for arming Ukraine against Russia, which spurred outrage. That was actually a headline from July of 2016 in which that raised alarms even publicly, right? Yeah. Add to that now. We now know that Donald Trump has taken calls and meetings with Vladimir Putin, including in Helsinki after that bizarre press conference. And here's an item from the Washington Post, and this is from Saturday. U.S. officials said there's no detailed record, even in classified files, of Trump's face-to-face interactions with the Russian leader at 5 locations over the past 2 years. Such a gap would be unusual in any presidency, let alone one in which Russia sought to install, through what U.S. intelligence agencies have described as an unprecedented campaign of election interference, the current occupant of the White House. Your thoughts?
I mean, There's so much there, Joy. I don't even know where to start, and I don't have enough time. But I mean, first on the platform, remember, Republicans were just as strong on voicing their concern about Russia being an adversary of the United States as Democrats were, and on the need to defend Ukraine. So it was highly unusual that coming out of the Republican convention, they had a softer platform than what President Obama was recommending, because the Republicans on the Hill, which obviously would have been the Republicans at the convention, were saying we need to do more to help Ukraine. So that was alarming. And then, of course, at the same time, you had newspaper accounts of Roger Stone, of Carter Page going and having these meetings in Russia. People like me were highly alarmed at even the few quotes we had coming out of the Obama administration. Fast forward then to, President Trump having these meetings with Vladimir Putin and not having staff present. I mean, that is outrageous, because it's unprecedented what he did there. And the fact that he then further, directed the interpreters to not talk to anyone and apparently took their notes on one occasion is, again, greater cause for concern. And you think to yourself, whose side is he on? Yeah. So obviously it's a huge problem. It's not surprising to those of us who have followed it.
Let's play last July, just as an example of this. The director of national intelligence, Dan Coates, is asked at the Aspen Institute about this Helsinki meeting, about these meetings that took place with Vladimir Putin. One would think at least the DNI would know what happened in these meetings, but here's what he said.
I don't know what happened in that meeting. I think as time goes by, and the president has already mentioned some things that happened in that meeting, I think we will learn more.
We have not learned more, Natasha. We have not learned more. Well, what's going on what is your reporting on the White House? Their 38 hours has not been the best. They've not been covered in glory in their responses. They haven't seemed to know what to say. What are you hearing about whether or not we are ever going to find out what happened in that Helsinki meeting?
Yeah, well, I was in the room when Dan Coates was speaking to Andrea Mitchell at the Aspen Security Forum, and let me tell you, you could hear a pin drop. People were just in shock that the Director of National Intelligence was not read into this, that he didn't seem to know anything about what the president was talking about with our biggest foreign adversary right now. And on top of that, he also was not told that the president was actually planning to invite Vladimir Putin to the White House after everything that has occurred over the last 2 years, after mounting evidence that Russia interfered in the election and that President Trump may have actually had a hand in that. In terms of the White House response, it's unsurprising that they would try to distract from the main points made in the Times article, which is that the FBI, of course, was extremely concerned that the president might be either compromised by or an agent of Russia. I think it's really telling that the president would not respond to that question directly when he was asked by Judge Janine last night. I'm sure that she was just expecting him to say, no, I am not an agent of Russia. But he, of course, went off on this tangent that ultimately made him look worse than it would have. But just one more point on the change in the Ukraine platform during the RNC convention. I did a lot of reporting on that, and I think it's really important that people realize that this was not something that was considered lightly by the Trump campaign. You had a man named J.D. Gordon, who was kind of the national security advisor to the campaign at that time. And when he heard that this amendment was being proposed to the platform, to the Ukraine platform, that would commit that the president and the Republicans would support arming Ukrainians against Russia, he jumped out of his seat and he rushed up there and he said, we need to table this amendment now so that I can make a call to New York, where, of course, Donald Trump's campaign was headquartered, and run this by them. Now, why was he so concerned about the optics of this? Why was he so concerned that Trump would be very wary of having that contained in the platform? That is a question, and it took a lot of prying before this man, J.D. Gordon, was willing to admit, yeah, I was acting at the direction of the campaign.
Yeah, and let's not forget who Paul Manafort, who was the campaign chairman, worked for, which was the Ukrainian leader who was in this way of Vladimir Putin. Jill Wine-Banks, you now have Congress with a lot more to look into, thanks to these two new reports and the fact that there may even be we don't know if it's an ongoing investigation into whether the president is working against U.S. national interest. One of the things that Congress apparently is going to look into is this Trump Tower that Donald Trump wanted to build in Moscow, and maybe give the penthouse to Vladimir Putin. Your thoughts?
I think that one of the things that's most interesting is something that Natasha just mentioned, which is the mounting evidence. And it's not just one piece of evidence. It's It is the Trump Tower in Moscow. It is so many things piled on top of each other. But because there are so many things, instead of it being one thing on top of the other, getting to be a huge mountain, it's pushing it down so that it's all subterranean and it's being buried. The diversion that the president does, that the White House does, is being successful among his base. And so that they're not seeing the facts and the danger to America. The fact that we're even talking about the fact that he could have been compromised or even being an agent of a foreign enemy is something that should be shocking to all Americans, not just to Democrats, not just to independents, but to the people who voted for this president. So I am concerned, and as a trial lawyer, I want to know, how do we get these facts out? How do we communicate them? And you've raised the answer, which is now that the Democrats have subpoena power and can have public hearings, we can educate the public. And hopefully all Americans will listen to those hearings and learn some facts that will influence how they feel about this going forward.
Yeah, I think there could be a very long conversation about the grooming of the conservative base to either be, in favor of Russia. I can remember people like Rudy Giuliani, even before Trump, saying that they thought Vladimir Putin was a better leader than our president, than President Obama. So that grooming, I don't think it started with Trump. That's a long conversation. Maybe we should have Frank do a little dissertation on it, because it's been happening. My panel's going to all come back, and we will continue this conversation after the break.